Within this week's video, we're going to finish up painting this wolf, and this time I'm going to show you how to use a large eraser to quickly add in a bunch of hair or fur for an animal painting. These erasers are made by an outstanding Japanese art company called Tombow. It's basically a very aggressive sand eraser used for erasing ink, but works incredibly well on acrylic paint like Createx illustration colors. You'll see that I'll be using this eraser a lot for this painting today, but for now, let's just pick up where we left off last time and finish up this painting. The first thing we need to do today is start painting in the left cheek here. So the color in my airbrush right now is black by Createx illustration color. And I'm basically just adding some value here on the left side so that I could erase into it. From here, I'm going to switch over to a stick eraser and start pulling out some highlights, erasing directly into this paint. I want to point out that I'm not erasing individual hairs here. Each one of these highlights that I pull out is basically a lock of hair, a bunch of hairs together, catching some light. If you think about painting hair, whether it's on a portrait or on an animal painting like we're doing today, it would be absolutely impossible to try to consider to paint every single hair that you see. So with using an eraser like this and later with that larger eraser that I showed in the beginning of the video, we're going to be painting the illusion of a bunch of hairs together rather than actually painting every single one. And the way that we're going to be creating this illusion is by using that eraser to remove paint, creating a highlight that has a gradient on it. It's going to be brightest where the light is hitting it, which is going to be closest to us, farthest away from the wolf. And then as it moves closer to the wolf's skin, it's going to get darker, and we're going to use an airbrush to create those gradients later on. Before I switch over to the airbrush to start adding on some paint for those gradients, I'm just going to go around each area one more time, adding some textures with the eraser and also using an awl, which is spelled AWL. It's basically a piece of metal that comes to a sharp point, or an X-Acto blade, either one to pull out some small highlights. The goal here is basically to get as much texture on as I need before I switch back over to that airbrush. So at this point, I would say that's good enough for the texture. Now I'm switching over to the airbrush and I'm going to slow this back down to real time to show you what I'm doing here. With black in my airbrush, I'm spraying some paint in between these highlights that I just pulled out. This is going to make those highlights look brighter because remember, the only way to create the illusion that something's bright in a painting is to have a dark value next to it. And as I'm spraying in between these highlights, I'm allowing some of that overspray to get onto the edges of the highlights itself. This is going to create that gradient that I was talking about. So what's happening here is very subtle. Each one of these highlights is going to be brightest in the center. That's where the light's hitting it. And as that highlight fades closer to the surface of the wolf, to the skin, it's going to get darker. So we're kind of creating an illusion that the hair is flowing, going dark where it's moving away and brighter where it's closer to us. And to further exaggerate this effect, I'm going back over these highlights again with the eraser, and I'm trying to erase in the center of them to have that bright area, that area which is closer to us as the viewer, a bit brighter than it was before. If I lost you here, don't worry about it. I'm going to show plenty more examples later on in this painting. Let's pay attention to this large highlight right here. I'm using my airbrush to spray around it, darkening up the edges of it, allowing some of that overspray to get on the highlight itself. That's going to darken up the lower side of it and the top side of it. Then with the eraser, I just pull out a few highlights over the top again in the brighter areas. And you can see right here, this is kind of showing that illusion. These areas which are brighter looks like some hair which is further up from the surface, and the darker areas just look like they're flowing away. And as I said in last week's video, which was the first part of this tutorial, that this painting is not about creating photorealism. It's just about the basics and fundamentals in painting to create those gradients and transitions so that when you look at this from far away, you get the impression that you're looking at hair or fur. You could of course use these techniques to push this much further into that photorealistic category. It's all about taking your time, attention to detail, and how well you can see all those minute, small little highlights and transitions from your reference. So I'm going to continue adding in this fur, paying attention to what I see in my reference. And remember that this technique is about erasing on a gessoed surface. So I'm erasing on gessoed canvas here. But if you're using a piece of paper with a layer or two of gesso, that'll work the same. When you erase out highlights for hair, if you'd like, you can actually erase out that gradient by erasing more paint in the center where the fur is going to be brightest, and then using less pressure as it moves along to the shadows. For me, to make this easier, I basically just erase out the full highlight all in one value, and then I use my airbrush to darken up the edges. For this next part, which is going to be the chest of the wolf, let's do the same thing by painting in some black paint first. I basically want to get an even layer of paint across this whole surface, And then to the left where some of these areas go into shadow, I'm just going to spray some more paint. Now using my eraser, I'm going to erase these in very quickly, just large masses of light, following the curve that I see in my reference. So only place up the completed painting on the left side of the screen so you can see what I'm painting towards. You can see that there's a very large mass of highlighted hair here on the wolf's chest just below his chin. But even though this area is much lighter than other parts of the painting, each one of these small locks of hair is going to have that transition of dark to light. So if you look what I'm doing on the right side of the screen, it's basically adding in individual locks of hair. Once one or two of them are placed in, I go back over to the airbrush, and then along the edge where it gets a bit darker, I just spray some more paint, giving that very subtle gradient. This way we're going to have a large area of highlight, this whole section right here that I circled, but also each one of the locks within that highlight are going to have their own gradient. I've talked about this a bunch of times in some of my other tutorials. I basically think of this as the difference between the macro and the micro. The macro highlight would be this large area on the chest here where it's much brighter than the areas surrounding it. And the micro would be each one of these individual locks of hairs. They're inside that highlight, but each one of those has that gradient and transition. And just to add a bit of detail, I added in a few flyaway hairs at the end of each one of these locks of hair, using that awl just to scratch out a few thin lines of paint. From here, I'm switching over to that large sand eraser that I showed in the beginning of this video, and you'll see that I'll be using this for the majority of the rest of this painting. For the majority of the hair on the wolf's body, you'll notice that there's not too much detail. Everything is kind of soft, so I don't need to use an X-Acto blade or an awl to scratch out thousands of small hairs. This large sand eraser is going to work very well to pull out really bright highlights, large locks of hair, and then from there we could switch over to the airbrush to add some gradients and maybe some subtle shadows within each one of those locks of hair. So it's really up to you to decide how you want to paint the fur on the wolf's chest here and body. If you want to go for a lot of detail, there's nothing wrong with using an X-Acto blade or an awl the entire time. But if you want to simplify it, I recommend sticking with either the stick eraser or even better, that large sand eraser. So now let's move over to the right side of the painting. And the first thing I did was lay down some color, just like we did before. And for this, I'm going to be mainly using this large sand eraser. I'm paying attention to where I see the highlights and also the curve, basically the way that the fur is growing. I'm trying the best I can to add some randomness to these locks of hair. I don't want them lined up like a picket fence, where each one is the same distance and they're all the same length. Natural looking and flowing hair is always going to have some irregularities to it and some randomness. So one way that I try to get around this is just by flicking out some hairs in the opposite direction. This way I'll break up any sort of pattern that I might be building. For this next part, I'm going to put some black paint down first so we can see where the shadows are. But where the bright highlights are, I'm going to leave some paint out. That way it's going to be easier to erase into this area. And in between those two dark shadows, using the sand eraser, I'm just going to pull out highlights for some hair down the length of this. And as I said before, each one of these hairs is going to need a gradient that goes from dark to light. So I'm going back to my airbrush and then spraying along the edge of it, darkening up those shadows, and just letting some of that overspray get on the edges of each one of these highlights, these locks of hair. And then to build up some of these values and textures, I'm just going back to the eraser and layering some more highlights on top of these, brightening up some areas so that they look closer to us. So the best thing about using this large sand eraser is that you can get this hair painted in extremely quickly. It's not going to have a ton of detail like what you'd get if you only used an X-Acto blade, but sometimes that's okay in a painting. And for the rest of this painting, I'm just going to follow that same process and technique over and over to paint in the rest of this hair. I'm going to speed through the rest of this because, again, it's that same process over and over, and I don't want to be repeating myself. If you're working on this technique, there's just a few things I want to remind you that you really need to have for this. One is an easily erasable paint like Createx illustration colors or ComArt. And if you use distilled water as a reducer, it's going to help break up that binder a bit more and make it even easier to erase. The second and equally important thing is to make sure that you're working on a very smooth surface. So here I'm using gessoed canvas that I prepare myself. I have plenty of videos showing you how to make your own. Or if you're using a paper, that'll work fine too. Maybe a hot pressed or a synthetic paper like Yupo paper. Just make sure you have a few layers of gesso on it so that you could use this technique of soft erasing. And that's where I'm going to call it with this tutorial. I think I went over pretty much everything I did on this one. If any of the channel members are interested in seeing how the paws were painted or the rest of the body, just leave a comment down below and I'll make a video just for the members so that you guys can see it. And of course, I want to say thank you to the members who generously help support this channel. First of all, a special shout out and a thank you to the two newest members of this channel, Mir Creative, and Leon. And of course, thank you so much to Mackie, Mark, SM, Cyril, Michael, Carl, Dwayne, Pete, Ken, Robert, M. Shibley, and Andrew. All of your support really helps make this channel possible, and I'm truly grateful for it. And again, members, if you're interested in a final part, like a part 3 of this video with the paws and the back of the body, I'll happily make a video just for you guys on the members page in a few weeks. So that's it for this one. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you back here next week.